A world before the name became known. In the closing years of the 19th century, much of Europe moved at a pace that would feel unhurried even by the standards of its own time. Days passed one after another with little to distinguish them beyond the weather, the church bells, and the predictable routines of work and rest. In small towns and villages scattered across the continent, people woke at familiar hours, ate familiar meals, and walked familiar paths without expecting history to take notice of them. Names were names only, spoken within families or among neighbors, not yet marked by memory or consequence. The landscape itself encouraged this quiet rhythm. Fields stretched outward in patient lines, bordered by hedges that had grown slowly over decades. Dirt roads connected one settlement to the next, carrying carts, livestock, and the occasional traveler whose arrival was noted briefly and then forgotten. Rivers moved steadily but without urgency, reflecting the sky in muted colors that changed gradually with the seasons. Forests stood where they had stood for generations, offering wood, shade, and a sense of permanence that few questioned. In these places, time was measured less by calendars than by habit. Morning began when light entered the windows. Evening arrived when lamps were lit. Weeks were shaped by market days and Sundays, months by planting and harvest. The future was rarely discussed in abstract terms. Most people expected life to resemble the lives that had come before them, and for the most part, it did. Homes were modest and functional. Walls were built thick to keep out cold winters and mild summers. Furniture was heavy and simple, arranged for use rather than beauty. Kitchens smelled of bread, soup, and boiled vegetables. Bedrooms were quiet spaces where sleep came easily after long hours of physical work. Children shared beds, adults shared worries that were small and practical: weather, prices, health, and usually manageable. In towns slightly larger than villages, daily life expanded only a little. Shops opened in the morning and closed in the evening. Bakers prepared loaves in predictable numbers. Cobblers repaired shoes that had been worn thin by repeated use. Clerks recorded figures carefully in ledgers, each line written with attention but little imagination. The sound of pen on paper, repeated thousands of times, marked the passing of hours indoors. Schools followed similar patterns. Lessons were repeated year after year, often taught the same way by the same instructors. Students memorized facts, copied text, and learned to sit still for long periods. The purpose of education was practical: reading, writing, arithmetic, and discipline. Creativity was not encouraged, nor was it discouraged. It simply did not matter much. Most students would return to familiar trades, carrying with them just enough knowledge to function. Beyond the towns, farms continued their quiet cycles. Animals were fed at regular intervals. Crops were tended patiently. There was little sense of urgency because there was little belief that speed improved outcomes. Work was done steadily, without haste, because it had always been done that way. The land responded slowly, and people adjusted themselves to that pace. In the evenings, families gathered in common rooms. Conversation was often minimal. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was expected. A father might read aloud from a newspaper, pausing frequently. A mother might sew or mend clothing, her hands moving automatically. Children listened or did not listen, drifting between attention and rest. These moments were not recorded, photographed, or preserved. They simply occurred and then ended. Europe at this time was divided into empires, kingdoms, and regions whose borders mattered more to governments than to most ordinary people. For villagers, authority was distant and abstract. Taxes were paid when required. Laws were followed because they were known and predictable. Politics existed, but it did not interrupt daily routines. Elections, when they occurred, were local events with limited consequence for most households. Transportation moved slowly enough to preserve isolation. Trains existed, but they did not reach everywhere. Travel required planning and time. Letters took days or weeks to arrive. News traveled gradually, losing urgency with each retelling. By the time information reached small towns, it often felt less like news and more like background noise. Religion played a steady, subdued role. Churches stood at the center of many communities, both physically and socially. Services followed the same structure week after week. Sermons were familiar in tone and content. Attendance was routine rather than passionate. Faith was less about revelation and more about continuity. Markets provided mild variation in otherwise predictable weeks. People gathered, exchanged goods, spoke briefly, and returned home. Prices fluctuated slightly. Weather influenced supply. These changes were noted, discussed, and then absorbed into routine. Nothing about them felt urgent or historic. Children grew up watching adults repeat the same actions day after day. They learned expectations without instruction. Boys prepared for trades, farming, or labor. Girls prepared for domestic responsibilities. Ambitions, when they existed, were modest and often unspoken. Few imagined altering the course of their lives in significant ways. Across the continent, similar scenes unfolded simultaneously. In Austria, Germany, Hungary, and beyond, millions lived lives defined by repetition. They woke, worked, ate, slept, and aged without any sense that their era would later be studied or remembered in detail. The present felt permanent, not transitional. Industrialization had begun to change some cities, but its effects were uneven. Factories operated on schedules that introduced clocks and shifts, yet even these followed predictable patterns. Workers arrived at set times, labored, and departed at set times. Machines hummed steadily, not dramatically. Progress, where it occurred, felt slow and mechanical rather than revolutionary. In rural areas especially, the 19th century seemed reluctant to end. Customs persisted, clothing styles changed gradually, language evolved slowly. Stories told by elders referenced events that had occurred decades earlier, blending memory with routine. History felt distant and abstract, something that belonged to books rather than lives. Weather remained one of the few unpredictable elements, yet even this followed recognizable patterns. Winters were cold, summers were warm. Spring arrived eventually. Autumn brought harvest. These changes were accepted without commentary. Complaints were brief and forgotten. At night, towns grew quiet early. Lamps were extinguished, streets emptied. Darkness settled evenly, interrupted only by occasional footsteps or distant sounds. Sleep arrived naturally, without artificial light or distraction. Dreams were private and unremarkable. No one in these places spoke of destiny or legacy. Names were not weighed for their future meaning. A child's birth was noted, celebrated briefly, and then absorbed into the ongoing flow of life. Records were kept in church books and municipal offices, written carefully and stored without ceremony. This was a world shaped by continuity rather than interruption. Change occurred, but slowly enough to be absorbed without resistance. People expected tomorrow to resemble today, and for the most part, it did. The end of the century approached quietly. Calendars changed, dates advanced. There were no announcements to mark the shift. Life continued with the same steady repetition it had always known. It was within this calm, ordinary, largely unnoticed world that countless individuals were born, grew, and passed their early years without distinction. At the time, they were simply part of the background, one more presence in a landscape defined by routine and patience. Nothing yet suggested that this calm would be disturbed.
Nothing hinted that certain names, once spoken casually or not at all, would later be remembered far beyond their original towns. For now, everything remained slow, familiar, and eventful. And so the days continued to pass, gently and without interruption, in a Europe that had not yet realized it stood at the edge of change, still resting comfortably in the long, quiet rhythm of ordinary time.
Early years spent in modest surroundings. Adolf Hitler was born into a world that did not expect much from any single individual. His early years unfolded quietly, without ceremony, in modest surroundings that resembled those of countless other families in Central Europe at the turn of the 20th century. Nothing about his childhood environment suggested importance, distinction, or future consequence. It was a setting defined by routine, small expectations, and the steady passage of ordinary time. His family lived in towns that were neither large nor influential. These places were shaped by administrative buildings, modest homes, and narrow streets where daily life followed predictable patterns. People rose early, attended to work, and returned home in the evening. The rhythm of these towns was steady and repetitive, offering little variation from one day to the next. The household itself reflected this ordinariness. Rooms were practical rather than comfortable, furnished with what was necessary and little more. Meals were simple, prepared regularly, and eaten without ceremony. Conversation within the home was typically brief and focused on immediate concerns. Silence was common and unremarkable. As a child, Hitler was neither especially remarkable nor especially unusual. He attended local schools where instruction followed rigid structures. Lessons emphasized obedience, memorization, and discipline. Teachers expected students to listen quietly, copy information accurately, and follow rules consistently. Creativity and independent thought were not central goals of education at the time. School days passed slowly. Mornings began at fixed hours. Students sat in rows, facing forward. The sound of chalk against slate boards filled the classrooms. Pages were turned carefully, assignments were completed methodically. Progress was measured not by curiosity, but by compliance. At home, expectations were similarly narrow. Children were expected to respect authority, complete chores, and avoid drawing attention to themselves. There was little encouragement to dream broadly or imagine alternative futures. Instead, life was presented as something already mapped out, with limited options and predictable outcomes. Leisure time, when it existed, was simple and repetitive. Children walked familiar routes, played uncomplicated games, and returned home at expected times. There were no elaborate entertainments, no constant stimulation. Evenings were quiet, lamps were lit, books were read slowly or not at all. The family moved occasionally, as was common for households connected to government or administrative work. Each move introduced a new town that looked much like the last. Streets changed names, buildings shifted slightly in appearance, but daily life remained essentially the same. These relocations did not bring excitement, they were absorbed into routine. Financial circumstances were modest and often uncertain. Money was managed carefully. Purchases were practical. Clothing was worn until it showed signs of age. Waste was avoided. This financial restraint was neither unusual nor especially burdensome. It was simply how most families lived. Within this environment, ambition developed slowly, if at all. Childhood dreams were vague and inconsistent. Interests shifted without direction. There was no clear path forward, no strong encouragement toward a particular future. Instead, time passed as it did for many others,
marked by school terms, household duties, and gradual aging. Adolescence brought little change to this pattern. Schooling continued, sometimes with difficulty, sometimes without notable success. Teachers recorded grades and attendance. Reports were written and filed. These documents were administrative in nature, not prophetic. They suggested neither greatness nor failure, only average performance and occasional struggle. Outside the classroom, life remained constrained by the same narrow boundaries. Cultural exposure was limited, travel was rare, information arrived slowly through newspapers or conversation, often stripped of urgency by the time it reached smaller towns. The broader world existed mostly as an abstract idea. Art, music, and literature were present, but not central. They were encountered occasionally, often passively. Interest in them did not immediately translate into skill or direction. Time spent thinking about such matters was sporadic and unfocused, easily interrupted by practical concerns. Family dynamics were structured and hierarchical. Authority was emphasized. Rules were enforced. Emotional expression was restrained. Praise was rare. Disapproval was more common, but usually understated. These dynamics were typical of the era and region, neither especially harsh nor especially nurturing. Health concerns, minor illnesses, and everyday discomforts came and went without drama. Medical care was limited. Recovery depended largely on rest and time. Such experiences were accepted as part of life rather than events worthy of attention. As years passed, the transition from childhood to early youth occurred gradually, without clear markers. There were no defining moments, no sudden changes in direction. Instead, life continued along a gentle slope, moving forward simply because time required it to do so. Early ambitions, when they appeared, were inconsistent and loosely formed. Ideas about the future shifted frequently. Plans were considered briefly and then abandoned. There was little sense of urgency or commitment. The future remained abstract and distant. Rejection and disappointment, when encountered, were absorbed quietly. They did not provoke immediate action or transformation. Instead, they blended into the background of everyday experience, joining other minor frustrations and unfulfilled expectations. Social relationships were limited and unremarkable. Friendships formed and faded without lasting impact. Interactions were shaped by proximity rather than deep connection. Conversations remained surface level, focused on shared surroundings rather than personal aspirations. The passage of time during these years was slow and largely unnoticed. Seasons changed, school terms ended and began again. Birthdays passed with modest acknowledgement. Nothing about these milestones suggested future significance. By the time youth began to give way to early adulthood, the patterns established in childhood remained largely intact. Life had not yet demanded decisive choices. Opportunities had not clearly presented themselves. The path forward was uncertain, but not in a dramatic or troubling way, only in the quiet, unresolved manner familiar to many. Throughout these early years, there was no sense that history was being shaped. Events unfolded without fanfare. Decisions were small and often reactive rather than intentional. The world felt stable, predictable, and slow. From the outside, this period appeared entirely ordinary. There were no signs of exceptional ability, no unmistakable warnings, no indications that these uneventful years would later be examined so closely. At the time, they were simply years like any other. Records from this period remain administrative and factual. They list addresses, dates, school enrollments, and basic observations. They do not interpret, they do not anticipate. They merely confirm that a child grew up within the expected boundaries of his time and place. In retrospect, it is tempting to search these years for meaning or clues, but experienced as they occurred, they offered none. They were defined by modest surroundings, limited expectations, and the steady repetition of daily life. Morning followed night, bells followed lessons, meals followed schedules, sleep followed fatigue. The sequence rarely varied. Change, when it came, did so gradually and without announcement. These early years passed quietly, leaving little impression on the world around them. They blended seamlessly into the broader fabric of late 19th and early 20th century European life, a fabric woven of routine, restraint, and continuity. Nothing yet suggested that this ordinary upbringing would later be revisited, analyzed, and remembered. At the time, it was simply life proceeding as expected, without interruption. And so these early years concluded not with resolution, but with continuation, carrying forward the habits, limitations, and unanswered questions of a youth spent in modest surroundings, shaped more by routine than by intention, and marked more by what did not happen than by what did.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Vienna moved with a steadiness that rarely called attention to itself. The city was large, layered, and old, but its daily life unfolded without urgency. Streets followed familiar paths, buildings stood where they had stood for decades, and people moved through their routines with practiced ease. Nothing about the city demanded haste. Time passed slowly, shaped by habit rather than ambition. The streets of Vienna were broad in some places and narrow in others, paved with stone that had been worn smooth by countless footsteps. Horse-drawn carts passed at predictable intervals, their wheels producing a steady, rhythmic sound against the ground. Pedestrians walked with purpose, but not speed, stopping occasionally at shop windows or street corners without any clear reason. Movement was constant, yet rarely hurried. Buildings rose in orderly rows, their facades reflecting architectural styles that valued symmetry and permanence. Apartments were stacked one above another, housing families whose lives overlapped only in stairwells and shared courtyards. Inside, rooms were functional and often dim, lit by windows that faced inward or toward narrow streets. These spaces were designed for living, not dreaming. Vienna's mornings began quietly. Shops opened their doors, bakers prepared familiar goods in familiar quantities, cafes arranged tables and chairs with methodical care. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, unchanged from day to day. Patrons arrived alone or in small groups, sat for long periods, and spoke little. Conversation, when it occurred, was subdued and unremarkable. Public transportation moved steadily through the city. Trams followed fixed routes, stopping at designated points with mechanical precision. Passengers boarded and exited without ceremony. Tickets were checked, seats were filled, windows revealed the same sequence of buildings each day, reinforcing the sense that nothing was changing very much. For those without stable employment, days stretched longer and felt less structured. Hours were filled with walking, waiting, and sitting. Public spaces, parks, libraries, and benches offered places to pass time without purpose. People lingered, observed, and moved on, rarely forming lasting connections. The city provided many opportunities to observe without participating. Museums displayed objects from distant times and places. Galleries showed works that required patience to appreciate. Churches opened their doors to visitors who entered quietly and left without comment. These institutions existed steadily, offering presence rather than inspiration. Vienna's parks were orderly and calm. Trees were planted in straight lines. Paths curved gently, encouraging slow walks. Benches invited rest rather than activity. People sat alone or in pairs, reading newspapers or simply watching others pass. Birds moved freely overhead, indifferent to the city below. Meals were modest and repetitive. Affordable food came from small restaurants or street vendors, offering the same dishes each day. Eating was practical, not social. Meals were consumed quietly, often alone, and rarely lingered over. Hunger was satisfied, but little else. Rooms rented by the night or week were common, especially for those without stable employment. These spaces were small and sparsely furnished. Beds were narrow. Tables served multiple purposes. Windows admitted limited light. Privacy was minimal, but solitude was common. Time spent indoors felt heavy and unmarked. Paperwork played an important role in daily life. Forms were filled out, submitted, and returned. Offices opened and closed at fixed times. Clerks worked steadily, stamping documents and recording information without deviation. Progress, when it occurred, was slow and procedural. Dreams, when present, existed quietly and without clear direction. Plans were imagined and then postponed. Ideas were considered but not acted upon. The city offered possibilities, but it did not push anyone toward them. Opportunity required initiative, and initiative was difficult to maintain in such a passive environment. Weather influenced the city subtly. Rain dampened streets and slowed movement slightly. Cold encouraged people to remain indoors. Warm days brought modest increases in outdoor activity. These changes were noted, but did not alter routines significantly. Libraries offered refuge for those seeking structure without obligation. Rows of books stood patiently on shelves. Readers sat silently at long tables, turning pages slowly. Time passed unnoticed within these walls, measured only by the gradual shift of light across the room. Evenings in Vienna arrived gently. Gas lamps were lit, shops closed their doors, streets grew quieter, though never entirely silent. Footsteps echoed softly, carriages became less frequent. The city settled into rest without ceremony. Cafes remained open late, providing warmth and continuity. Patrons stayed for hours, ordering little and saying less. Smoke hung in the air. Cups were refilled without comment. These spaces allowed time to pass without demand or expectation. Social interactions were limited and restrained. Acquaintances recognized one another without forming deep bonds. Conversations remained surface level, often revolving around daily observations rather than personal goals. Relationships drifted rather than developed. Cultural life existed alongside this quiet routine, but participation required resources and confidence. Concert halls hosted performances attended by those with means. Theaters followed schedules. Applause came and went. For many, these events were observed from a distance or not at all. The city's administrative nature reinforced patience. Processes took time. Decisions were delayed. Responses arrived slowly. This pace discouraged urgency and rewarded endurance. Waiting became a skill practiced daily. Days often ended without resolution. Nothing significant had been accomplished, but nothing had been lost either. This neutrality defined the experience. Life neither advanced nor retreated, it simply continued. For those living on the margins, the city provided survival without fulfillment. Food, shelter, and public space were available, but direction was not. Aspirations remained abstract, disconnected from daily action. Morning returned as expected. Bells rang, shops opened, streets filled again. The cycle repeated with minimal variation. One day blended into the next, making time feel heavy and indistinct. Letters arrived occasionally, carrying news that was already outdated. Responses were written slowly, or not at all. Communication lacked urgency, reinforcing the sense that nothing required immediate attention.
Money, when scarce, shaped decisions quietly. Expenditures were calculated, comforts were postponed, survival took precedence over ambition. This focus narrowed the future to manageable steps rather than distant goals. The city itself remained indifferent. Buildings did not respond to hopes or frustrations. Streets offered passage, not guidance. Vienna existed as a setting rather than a participant, accommodating countless lives without favor. Months passed, seasons shifted. Snow softened the city's edges. Spring returned greenery to parks. These changes were welcome but temporary, quickly absorbed into routine. Over time, unrealized dreams lost their sharpness. They became background thoughts rather than active plans. Disappointment faded into acceptance, not because circumstances improved, but because energy diminished. The pace of life encouraged reflection without action. Thoughts circled familiar ideas. Decisions were reconsidered repeatedly without resolution. Movement occurred physically, but not directionally. By the end of these years, little had changed outwardly. Addresses shifted, rooms changed, daily routes altered slightly, but the overall pattern remained intact, slow, repetitive, and unresolved. Vienna continued its quiet existence, supporting millions of similar stories unfolding simultaneously. Most of them left no record beyond registration forms and rental agreements. They were lived fully, yet without distinction. This period passed without announcement. There were no markers to indicate its importance. At the time, it was simply life continuing as expected within a city that asked little and promised less. The days spent in Vienna blended together, forming a stretch of time defined not by achievement, but by endurance. It was a chapter shaped by waiting, observation, and the gradual dulling of expectation. Nothing yet suggested that these unrealized days would later be examined or remembered.
The long, difficult passage through the First World War. When the First World War began, it did not immediately feel like a single, clear event. For many people, it arrived gradually through announcements, notices, and changes in routine rather than through sudden disruption. Life did not stop all at once. Instead, it slowed, adjusted, and reshaped itself around new demands that were often confusing and poorly explained. Mobilization took time. Papers were processed, orders were distributed, men waited to be called, then waited again after being called. Trains arrived on schedule, filled, departed, and returned. Stations became places of long pauses rather than decisive movement. Platforms were crowded but quiet. Goodbyes were brief and restrained, often unfinished. For soldiers, much of the war consisted of travel and waiting. Days were spent moving from one location to another, often without understanding why. Instructions were followed because they were given, not because they were understood. Luggage was carried, set down, and carried again. Camps were temporary, but lingered longer than expected. Uniforms were issued in standard sizes. Boots were uncomfortable. Equipment was heavy and often unnecessary. Adjustments were made slowly. Complaints were common but rarely addressed. The novelty of military life faded quickly, replaced by routine. Training occupied long stretches of time. Drills were repeated daily. Movements were practiced again and again. Commands were memorized. Progress was measured in compliance rather than competence. Many hours passed without meaningful variation. Food was regular but unremarkable. Meals were served at fixed times, consisting of simple, filling items. Eating became mechanical. Hunger was managed, not eliminated. Taste mattered less than availability. Once near the front, the pace slowed further.
Trenches extended across the landscape in long, continuous lines. They were dug carefully, maintained constantly, and occupied endlessly. Soldiers stood, sat, or lay in confined spaces, often doing very little. The days blended together, morning inspections followed by waiting, afternoons marked by small tasks, evenings that felt long and unresolved, nights interrupted by noise, cold, or discomfort rather than action. Weather became a dominant feature of experience. Rain filled trenches with mud. Cold settled into clothing and joints. Heat made air heavy and movement tiring. These conditions persisted without relief, becoming part of the background rather than notable events. Orders arrived slowly and were often unclear. Movements were planned, delayed, revised, and sometimes canceled altogether. Soldiers learned patience by necessity. Action was rare, anticipation was constant. For many, the war was defined by absence of information, of progress, of resolution. Letters from home arrived sporadically, carrying news that felt distant and outdated. Replies were written slowly, sometimes never sent. The soundscape of the war was repetitive. Distant artillery rumbled without pause. Small noises, tools, footsteps, voices echoed through confined spaces. Silence, when it occurred, felt temporary rather than peaceful. Medical care focused on maintenance rather than recovery. Minor injuries were common. Illness spread easily. Treatment was basic and often ineffective. Rest was prescribed when possible. Return to duty followed quickly. Camaraderie existed, but developed quietly. Conversations were short and practical. Stories were repeated. Jokes lost their effect. Relationships formed through proximity rather than shared purpose. Time moved differently during the war. Days felt long, but months passed unnoticed. Seasons changed with little ceremony. Calendars mattered less than routines. The future remained abstract and undefined. Behind the lines, support roles mirrored the same monotony. Clerks processed documents endlessly. Supply officers counted and recounted materials. Drivers followed routes repeatedly. Each task contributed without offering satisfaction. Civilians experienced a similar pattern of waiting and repetition. Food shortages altered meals. Queues formed and dissolved. Work continued under new constraints. News arrived slowly and incompletely. Factories adjusted schedules and output. Workers performed the same motions hour after hour. Production increased, but variety disappeared. The workday lengthened without becoming more meaningful. Governments issued statements that promised progress without specifying timelines. Citizens listened, waited, and returned to routine. Enthusiasm diminished quietly, replaced by endurance. As the war continued, expectations lowered. Victory became less immediate, then less certain. Conversations shifted from outcomes to survival. People learned not to ask when it would end. Leave periods were brief and structured. Soldiers returned home temporarily, only to find that home had changed little and too much at the same time. Departures were quieter than arrivals. Transportation networks operated constantly. Trains moved men and supplies back and forth. Schedules were maintained. Delays were common. Motion did not imply advancement. Paperwork increased as the war progressed. Reports, lists, and records multiplied. The administrative side of war expanded steadily, absorbing time and attention without producing visible results. The emotional tone of the war flattened. Fear existed, but it was dull rather than sharp. Hope persisted, but it was restrained. Fatigue became the dominant sensation. Repetition defined experience. The same paths were walked, the same positions were held, the same conversations occurred. Change was incremental and rarely noticeable. Losses were acknowledged formally and absorbed quietly. Names were read, notices were delivered, life continued, mourning blended into routine. For those directly involved, the war felt less like a sequence of events and more like a prolonged condition. It was something one endured rather than participated in actively. By the later years, the war had become background. It shaped every decision, but rarely demanded attention. Its presence was constant, but its meaning was unclear. When movements occurred, they were limited and cautious. Gains were measured in small distances. Progress was slow and easily reversed. Maps changed gradually. Supplies arrived inconsistently. Shortages were managed through substitution. Comforts disappeared without comment. Adaptation became automatic. Sleep was irregular. Rest was shallow. Fatigue accumulated slowly. Days continued regardless. As time passed, the beginning of the war felt distant and indistinct. The idea of peace became abstract. People focused on immediate tasks because they were manageable. Eventually, signs of conclusion appeared, but they were subtle. Routines shifted slightly. Orders changed tone. Movement increased, then slowed again. When the war finally ended, it did not conclude with clarity for everyone. Announcements were made, celebrations occurred in some places, in others life simply continued with fewer restrictions. For those directly involved, the transition back to non-war life was gradual and confusing. Habits formed during years of repetition did not disappear quickly. Waiting remained familiar. The war left behind exhaustion rather than resolution. It had been long, difficult, and defined less by action than by endurance. Its memory settled slowly, shaped by repetition and monotony. For those who lived through it, the First World War was not a series of dramatic moments, but an extended passage of time marked by routine, patience, and the quiet persistence of ordinary days. It passed as it had been lived, slowly, unevenly, and without clear meaning, leaving behind a world that continued forward, carrying the weight of years spent waiting for something that rarely arrived.
Germany in the aftermath of defeat and uncertainty. When the war ended, Germany did not suddenly become quiet or clear. Instead, it entered a long period of uncertainty that unfolded slowly and without resolution. The transition from wartime to peacetime did not arrive with a single moment of understanding. It developed gradually, marked by pauses, adjustments, and a general sense that familiar structures had weakened without being replaced. Cities remained standing, but their purpose felt altered. Streets were still walked, shops still opened, and trains still ran, yet the direction of daily life seemed less certain. People continued to move through routines, though the reasons behind those routines were less obvious than before. The war had ended, but the habits it created lingered. Inflation became a steady presence rather than a sudden crisis. Prices changed frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes within the same afternoon. Money lost its reliability. Coins and bills still circulated, but their meaning shifted. A wage earned in the morning might purchase less by evening. People noticed this without fully understanding it. Shops adjusted by rewriting price tags repeatedly. Clerks spent time erasing numbers and replacing them with new ones. Customers stood in lines that moved slowly, calculating whether they could afford items that had once been ordinary. Purchases became cautious and deliberate. Savings lost value quietly. Bank books showed numbers that looked impressive but bought little.
Those who had planned carefully found that planning no longer produced predictable results. This realization settled in gradually, producing resignation rather than panic. Unemployment increased without clear explanation. Factories reduced hours or closed entirely. Workers arrived to find notices posted on doors. Others continued to work, but for shorter periods. Employment became temporary and uncertain, extending the feeling that nothing was stable. Those without work developed new routines built around waiting. Days were spent walking familiar routes, visiting offices, and standing in lines. Applications were filled out, submitted, and often ignored. Responses, when they came, offered little clarity. Government offices remained open and functional, but their processes felt slow and disconnected. Forms were distributed and collected. Officials spoke carefully, avoiding definitive statements. Decisions were delayed. People learned to expect postponement. Public transportation continued operating, though schedules changed. Trams arrived late, trains were crowded but subdued. Passengers traveled quietly, often without destination beyond necessity. Movement did not imply progress, it simply filled time. Food shortages influenced daily habits. Meals became simpler and more repetitive. Substitutions were common. Families adjusted recipes to available ingredients. Eating remained necessary, but pleasure diminished. Markets reflected this uncertainty. Stalls offered fewer goods. Prices fluctuated. Bargaining increased but achieved little. Shoppers compared options carefully before deciding to buy or not buy at all. Housing conditions remained tight. Rent was paid when possible. Repairs were postponed. Rooms were shared more frequently. Privacy decreased, but solitude remained common. Neighbors lived close without forming strong connections. Conversations shifted in tone. Where once people spoke about events, they now spoke about conditions. Inflation, shortages, and uncertainty became standard topics. These discussions rarely led to conclusions. They ended with shrugs or silence. News arrived regularly, but provided limited reassurance. Newspapers reported developments using cautious language. Headlines promised improvement without details. Readers skimmed articles and set papers aside without comment. Political changes occurred, but they felt distant to many. New structures were discussed, debated, and revised. For ordinary citizens, these changes translated slowly into daily life, often without clear impact. Public gatherings were modest and restrained. People attended meetings, listened briefly, and returned home. Enthusiasm was limited. Fatigue shaped participation more than interest. Schools reopened and continued operating. Lessons resumed, though resources were limited. Students attended classes as expected. Education continued because it was familiar, not because it promised immediate benefit. Children adapted easily to these conditions. They accepted limitations without comparison. Play remained simple. Expectations adjusted quietly. Adults found adjustment more difficult. Habits formed before the war no longer aligned with current reality. Effort did not always produce results. This mismatch created a sense of confusion that lingered without resolution. Work, when available, focused on maintenance rather than growth. Repairing, sorting, and accounting replaced expansion. Businesses aimed to continue rather than improve. Stability became the goal, though it remained elusive. Currency reform was discussed repeatedly. Announcements were made. Changes were anticipated. In practice, confusion persisted. People learned to calculate quickly and carry money in large quantities. Queues became a defining feature of daily life. Lines formed early and dissolved late. Waiting became a skill. People stood quietly, holding papers or containers, unsure of outcome. Weather influenced mood, but not direction.
cold made shortages more uncomfortable. Warm days encouraged brief outdoor activity. Seasons passed as expected, offering continuity where other structures failed. Transportation of goods occurred irregularly. Deliveries arrived late or incomplete. Merchants adjusted expectations downward. Customers adapted without protest. Social life narrowed. Visits were shorter. Hospitality became limited. Gatherings occurred less frequently. Fatigue shaped interaction more than desire. Religious institutions continued their schedules. Services were held. Attendance remained steady but subdued. Faith offered routine rather than explanation. Cultural institutions operated with reduced resources. Performances occurred occasionally. Audiences attended quietly. Applause was polite and brief. The pace of life slowed further. Without clear goals, days expanded. People focused on immediate needs because they were manageable. Long-term plans felt impractical. Bureaucracy increased in presence and importance. Documents were required for many activities. Offices processed requests slowly. Compliance became routine. Trust in systems weakened without disappearing entirely. People followed rules because alternatives were unclear. Skepticism existed quietly, without confrontation. As months passed, the immediate shock of defeat faded, replaced by prolonged uncertainty. The end of war did not bring clarity, it brought adjustment to a different kind of difficulty. Memories of wartime routines lingered. The discipline of scarcity remained. Habits persisted even when circumstances changed slightly. Rural areas experienced similar patterns with different details. Agricultural work continued, but prices fluctuated. Equipment was scarce. Labor was inconsistent. Communication between regions remained uneven. Information traveled slowly. Local conditions varied widely, making national understanding difficult. Expectations lowered gradually. Success was redefined as continuation rather than improvement. Survival became the measure. Public morale stabilized at a subdued level. Hope existed without enthusiasm. Despair was present without drama. Most people occupied a middle space defined by endurance. Time continued to pass without clear markers. Months blended together. Holidays were observed quietly. Celebrations were modest. Children grew accustomed to limitations, integrating them into normal life. Adults adjusted more slowly, carrying comparisons that no longer applied. Eventually, routine settled into a new pattern, not better, not worse, simply different. Life resumed a steady rhythm shaped by caution. Germany in these years was neither collapsing nor recovering decisively. It was waiting for stability, for clarity, for conditions to change in ways that could be understood. This waiting defined the atmosphere. It slowed movement, reduced expectation, and dulled emotion. People learned to live within uncertainty rather than resolve it. Days ended as they began, quietly, without conclusion. Lights were turned off, streets emptied. Sleep arrived not from satisfaction, but from fatigue. Morning returned with the
gradual political involvement without urgency. In the years following the war, political life in Germany did not immediately present itself as a clear path or a defined calling. For many individuals, involvement began not with conviction, but with proximity, attendance at meetings, exposure to discussions, and the slow accumulation of familiarity. Politics entered daily life gradually, often through routine rather than intention. Early participation was modest. Meetings were held in small rooms, often poorly lit and sparsely furnished. Chairs were arranged closely together. Attendance varied from week to week. People arrived, sat, listened, and left. These gatherings were not dramatic events. They followed predictable patterns and ended without resolution. Discussion topics were repetitive. Speakers returned to the same themes, sometimes using similar language from one meeting to the next. Notes were taken, papers were distributed, questions were asked quietly, if at all. Much of the time was spent listening rather than responding. Administrative tasks formed a large part of political activity. Membership lists were created and updated. Records were kept. Dues were collected in small amounts. These tasks required patience more than enthusiasm. Progress was measured by organization rather than outcome. Speeches were delivered frequently, though their settings were informal. Rooms echoed with voices that varied in tone but not in structure. Audiences listened politely. Applause when it occurred was brief. There was little sense of momentum. Words filled time without clearly changing direction. Preparation occupied more hours than performance. Notes were reviewed, phrases were practiced, topics were repeated. This preparation emphasized consistency rather than innovation. Familiarity was valued because it reduced uncertainty. Travel between meetings involved ordinary logistics. Trains were taken, tickets were purchased, waiting rooms were occupied, schedules were followed. These movements were slow and uneventful, blending into the larger pattern of post-war routine. Political organizations themselves were unstable and frequently reorganized. Names changed, roles shifted, structures were revised. These changes were discussed at length and implemented slowly. The emphasis remained on procedure. Paperwork accumulated steadily. Forms were filed, correspondence was written and answered. Documents moved between offices at a measured pace. Much of political life occurred on paper, away from public attention. Relationships within these circles developed gradually. Acquaintances became familiar faces. Conversations remained formal. Trust, when it formed, did so through repetition, not intimacy. Disagreements were often deferred rather than resolved. The language of politics during this period was cautious and repetitive. Statements avoided precision. Promises were broad. Explanations lacked detail. This style reflected uncertainty more than strategy. Public response was limited. Meetings attracted small audiences. Interest fluctuated. Many citizens remained disengaged, focused on daily survival rather than abstract discussions. Political activity existed alongside ordinary life without dominating it. Organizational growth, when it occurred, was incremental. New members joined slowly. Records were updated. Responsibilities were assigned. Expansion required time and persistence. Speaking engagements increased in number, but not in scale. Locations changed, but formats remained consistent. Arrival, speech, departure. Each followed the same sequence. There was little variation. Financial resources were modest. Funds were raised in small amounts. Expenses were calculated carefully. Budgeting consumed attention. Limitations shaped decisions quietly. Coordination with other groups required correspondence and meetings. Agreements were tentative. Plans were revised frequently. Cooperation advanced slowly, hindered by differing priorities and limited trust. The broader political environment was crowded and confusing. Multiple groups competed for attention. Messages overlapped. Distinctions were unclear. For many participants, this complexity discouraged urgency. Legal requirements added structure and delay. Registrations were submitted, permissions were requested. Compliance took time. These processes slowed momentum and reinforced routine. Public appearances were scheduled carefully. Venues were selected based on availability rather than symbolism. Attendance was uncertain. Outcomes were unpredictable. Between events, long periods passed with little activity. Planning filled some of this time. Waiting filled the rest. Progress was not continuous. It occurred in small steps separated by pauses. Media coverage, when present, was limited. Articles were brief. Mentions were factual. Impact was minimal. Public awareness remained low.
Internal discussions focused on organization rather than vision. Roles were clarified, responsibilities assigned. Efficiency was pursued incrementally. Training and preparation emphasized repetition. Speaking techniques were practiced. Messaging was standardized. Consistency reduced effort, but also limited change. As months passed, involvement deepened through familiarity rather than decision. Attendance became habitual. Participation followed expectation. Political activity integrated into routine life. There were no single moments that defined this transition. Instead, a sequence of ordinary actions accumulated over time. Meetings attended, papers filed, speeches delivered. The pace discouraged reflection. Movement occurred without clear direction. Engagement continued because it had begun, not because it promised resolution. Administrative success became a marker of progress. Documents completed, schedules maintained. These achievements were modest but tangible. Interactions with authorities were formal and procedural. Requests were submitted, responses arrived slowly. Compliance was emphasized. Public reaction remained subdued. Enthusiasm was limited. Indifference was common. Political life existed, but did not dominate public attention. The routine nature of involvement reduced emotional intensity. Activities felt repetitive. Motivation fluctuated. Persistence replaced excitement. As organizational responsibilities increased, time was divided between planning and execution. Both followed established patterns. Travel continued. Meetings repeated. Paperwork expanded. Each action reinforced the next, creating continuity without urgency. Political life during this period resembled administrative work more than movement. It required patience, organization, and endurance. There was little sense of immediacy. Goals were distant. Outcomes were uncertain. Activity focused on maintenance rather than change. The environment encouraged gradualism. Sudden shifts were rare. Continuity prevailed. As involvement deepened, it did so quietly. There were no announcements to mark progression. Participation expanded because routine allowed it. By the end of this phase, political engagement had become a regular feature of daily life. It occupied time, required attention, and followed schedules. Yet it remained one part of a larger existence shaped by post-war conditions, uncertainty, fatigue, and routine. This period passed without drama. It left behind records rather than memories. Minutes of meetings, lists of attendees, copies of speeches. In retrospect, it appears as a gradual accumulation rather than a turning point. Experienced at the time, it felt like continued waiting, structured by paperwork and repetition. Political involvement did not arrive with urgency. It settled slowly, becoming familiar through repetition rather than conviction. Days ended as they began, quietly. Meetings concluded, papers were gathered, rooms emptied, streets returned to stillness. Morning brought new schedules. Notices were read, plans were reviewed, the cycle resumed. In this way, political life advanced without haste, shaped less by decisive moments than by the steady persistence of ordinary actions repeated over time. It was a process defined not by sudden change, but by continuity, one meeting after another, one document after another, until participation became simply another routine within an already cautious and tired society.
The slow ascent through bureaucracy and routine. The years that followed gradual political involvement did not unfold with sudden movement or clear direction. Instead, they were shaped by procedures, schedules, and repeated administrative tasks that filled days without drawing attention to themselves. Political ascent, where it occurred, did so quietly, built from routine rather than decisive moments. Organizations expanded slowly. Membership lists were updated regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. Names were added, corrected, or removed. These lists were stored in folders, reviewed at meetings, and referenced during planning. The process was careful and time-consuming, offering a sense of order without urgency. Meetings became more frequent, but no more dramatic. Rooms were reserved, chairs were arranged, attendance was counted, agendas were read aloud. Discussion followed predictable patterns, returning to familiar topics with little variation. Decisions were postponed, revisited, and occasionally recorded. Elections, when they occurred, were procedural rather than celebratory. Notices were posted, campaign periods were scheduled, ballots were prepared. Voters participated unevenly, often without enthusiasm. Results were announced formally and absorbed quietly. Campaigning itself was repetitive. Speeches were delivered in similar formats across different locations. Language remained consistent. Themes were reused. Audiences varied in size, but rarely in response. Applause was polite and brief. Printed materials required planning and coordination. Text was drafted, reviewed, and approved. Printers were contacted. Quantities were calculated carefully to avoid waste. Distribution followed established routes. These materials circulated steadily, reinforcing messages through repetition rather than innovation. Administrative offices grew in importance. Paperwork increased. Correspondence expanded. Letters were written, answered, and filed. Records were maintained meticulously. Much of political life took place at desks rather than in public spaces. Schedules governed activity. Travel dates were set in advance. Meetings were planned weeks ahead. Adjustments were made when necessary, often causing delays. Waiting became a routine component of progress. Coordination between regional groups required additional layers of communication. Reports were requested and submitted. Summaries were prepared. Differences were noted but rarely resolved quickly. Uniformity was pursued slowly. Finances demanded constant attention. Contributions were recorded. Expenses were tracked. Budgets were revised. Limitations shaped decisions quietly, ensuring that growth remained gradual. Electoral cycles repeated predictably. Preparation began months in advance. Activities intensified briefly and then subsided. Results produced minor adjustments rather than transformation. Public engagement increased incrementally. Attendance rose slightly. Awareness expanded slowly. Interest remained uneven. Many citizens observed without participating. Propaganda work followed routine patterns. Messages were standardized. Distribution methods were refined. Repetition was emphasized because it reduced effort and uncertainty. Innovation was limited. Volunteers performed assigned tasks methodically. Posters were placed. Notices were handed out. Routes were followed. Completion was checked and recorded. Internal training emphasized consistency. Speakers practiced delivery. Talking points were memorized. Variations were discouraged to maintain uniform messaging. The pace of advancement reflected institutional constraints. Bureaucratic processes slowed momentum. Approvals required time. Coordination required patience. Public offices interacted with organizations through formal channels. Requests were submitted. Responses arrived slowly. Decisions were communicated indirectly. Media coverage expanded gradually. Articles appeared occasionally. Tone remained factual. Impact accumulated slowly rather than dramatically. Elections at different levels followed similar procedures. Preparation, participation, counting, reporting, each step followed established rules. Outcomes were processed calmly. Between election periods, routine dominated. Planning continued. Records were maintained. Communication persisted. Progress was incremental. Organizational hierarchy developed gradually. Roles were defined, responsibilities assigned. Authority expanded through repetition rather than announcement. Travel remained constant. Routes became familiar.
Waiting rooms were occupied regularly. Movement filled time without accelerating change. Opposition existed but was managed procedurally. Debates were held, statements issued, disagreements were documented rather than resolved decisively. Legal challenges required additional paperwork. Responses were prepared carefully. Timelines extended. Outcomes were delayed. Public demonstrations, when organized, followed permits and schedules. Participation varied. Impact was limited. Events concluded without lasting change. Membership engagement required maintenance. Notices were sent. Meetings scheduled. Attendance tracked. Retention became an ongoing concern. Administrative expansion created additional work. New offices required staffing. Procedures were standardized. Oversight increased. Routine reinforced familiarity. Activities repeated enough times to become expected. Surprise diminished. As time passed, advancement occurred through accumulation. Each small step built upon previous ones. There were no clear dividing lines. The bureaucracy itself became a stabilizing force. Processes provided structure. Routine offered predictability. Change occurred within narrow limits. Election results were absorbed into planning. Adjustments were made. Strategies were revised modestly. Public messaging remained consistent. Familiar phrases reappeared. Recognition increased through repetition rather than persuasion. Institutional presence expanded gradually. Offices became permanent. Staff roles solidified. Operations continued steadily. Documentation increased steadily. Archives grew. Records were preserved. Administrative memory replaced individual initiative. As responsibilities expanded, focus shifted towards maintenance. Preserving existing structures required attention. Growth slowed further. Public perception evolved slowly. Familiarity replaced novelty. Engagement stabilized at moderate levels. The slow ascent did not feel like ascent at the time. It felt like work, repetitive, administrative, and continuous. Daily schedules filled with meetings, correspondence, and preparation. Breaks were brief. Completion was temporary. Evenings ended quietly. Papers were gathered. Offices closed. Streets returned to stillness. Morning reopened routines. Schedules resumed. Tasks awaited completion. In this way, political advancement unfolded through bureaucracy and routine rather than dramatic change. It was shaped by paperwork, repetition, and patient persistence. There were no defining moments, only accumulated actions. Progress was measured in organization rather than excitement. The years passed with little outward indication of transformation. Structures strengthened quietly. Presence expanded incrementally. This ascent was slow by design and by circumstance. It relied on systems rather than inspiration. When later examined, these years appear methodical and dull. Experienced at the time, they felt like continuous administration. Routine replaced urgency. Bureaucracy replaced spontaneity. Advancement became a function of endurance. And so the slow ascent continued, carried forward by meetings, elections, documents, and repeated messages, each step unremarkable on its own, yet together forming a steady, patient movement shaped almost entirely by routine.
Life in Germany under an increasingly controlled state. Life in Germany during the years of increasing state control did not transform overnight. Instead, it adjusted itself slowly through small changes that were easy to overlook in daily routine. For many ordinary citizens, each day still began much as it had before, shaped by work schedules, household responsibilities, and familiar public spaces. The difference lay not in sudden disruption, but in gradual accumulation. Regulations appeared quietly. Notices were posted on walls, in offices, and at street corners. They were written in formal language and explained expectations without urgency. People read them briefly, noted the requirements, and continued with their day. Compliance became part of routine rather than a conscious decision. Workplaces adjusted their procedures incrementally. Schedules were revised. Reporting requirements increased. Meetings became more structured. Employees filled out additional forms and followed new instructions that resembled older ones, only slightly more detailed. Public offices expanded their reach through paperwork. Documents were requested more frequently. Identification was required in more situations. Records were kept carefully. These processes were time-consuming but familiar, encouraging acceptance through repetition. Transportation continued operating on fixed timetables. Trains arrived and departed as scheduled. Tickets were checked more thoroughly. Announcements were made clearly and calmly. Passengers adapted without comment, incorporating these checks into travel expectations. Shops remained open and functional. Hours were posted and enforced. Goods were displayed neatly. Purchases were made quietly. Some items became scarce, others abundant. Adjustments were made without ceremony. Daily routines remained largely intact. Morning followed night. Meals were prepared at regular times. Children attended school. Adults went to work or sought it. Evenings ended quietly. The structure of the day provided continuity. Schools emphasized discipline and consistency. Lessons followed approved guidelines. Activities were planned carefully. Students learned to follow schedules and instructions precisely. Education continued steadily, framed by regulation rather than curiosity. Public gatherings followed permits and schedules. Events were organized formally. Attendance was noted. Programs followed printed agendas. Participation was orderly and restrained. Media adjusted tone gradually. Reports became more uniform in style. Language emphasized stability and order. Readers noticed the consistency, but rarely discussed it openly. Newspapers continued to arrive each morning, folded and familiar. Cultural institutions operated within guidelines. Performances were scheduled. Exhibitions were planned. Content followed approved themes. Audiences attended quietly, appreciating familiarity over novelty. Community organizations adapted their activities. Meetings were structured. Membership lists were maintained. Activities aligned with regulations. Social life continued within defined boundaries. Street life remained calm. Pedestrians followed signals. Police presence increased, but blended into the background. Uniforms became a common sight, accepted as part of the landscape. Communication became more formal. Correspondence followed approved channels. Language was cautious. Expressions remained restrained. Conversations focused on practical matters. Households adjusted without discussion. Radios were turned on and off at scheduled times. Information was received passively. Commentary was minimal. Workdays followed strict schedules. Breaks were timed. Output was measured. Efficiency became a recurring topic. Workers adapted by focusing on tasks rather than outcomes. Administrative expansion increased the importance of compliance. Forms multiplied. Instructions were clarified repeatedly. Errors were corrected through additional documentation. Public services operated steadily. Utilities functioned. Maintenance continued. Repairs were planned methodically. The appearance of normalcy was preserved. The pace of change discouraged alarm. Adjustments were small and spaced over time. Each new requirement resembled the last. Resistance seemed unnecessary to many because disruption felt minimal.
Language in public spaces emphasized order and responsibility. Signs were clear and instructional. Compliance was expected and generally given. Social interactions narrowed in focus. Conversations avoided abstract topics. Practical concerns dominated. Silence became more common and less uncomfortable. Employment conditions varied but followed regulation. Job assignments were clear. Expectations were defined. Advancement depended on adherence to procedure. Transportation of goods followed regulated routes. Deliveries were scheduled. Delays were managed administratively. Supply chains adapted quietly. Religious services continued with adjusted guidelines. Attendance remained steady. Rituals followed tradition. Sermons emphasized order and patience. Leisure activities were structured. Clubs followed schedules. Recreation occurred within defined limits. Free time existed but was organized. Public announcements were frequent but calm. Instructions were repeated. Language remained consistent. Citizens absorbed information without urgency. As months passed, these routines solidified. What had once felt new became expected. Regulations integrated into daily life, shaping behavior subtly. Children grew accustomed to structure. They followed rules naturally. Expectations felt normal. Adjustment occurred through repetition. Adults adapted through habit. Compliance required little thought. Daily life demanded attention to procedure rather than reflection. The state's presence expanded administratively rather than visibly. Offices grew. Records accumulated. Oversight increased without dramatic enforcement. Public celebrations followed official schedules. Events were orderly. Participation was encouraged but managed. Displays were planned carefully. Travel required documentation. Checks were routine. Delays were accepted. Movement continued within defined limits. Communication between regions followed standardized channels. Information was consistent. Variation diminished. Economic life followed regulations. Prices were monitored. Production targets were set. Compliance ensured stability. Public health measures were organized administratively. Inspections occurred. Records were maintained. Routine prevailed. The gradual nature of control made it less noticeable. Each change was small enough to accept. Together, they formed a structured environment. Life did not feel chaotic. It felt organized, scheduled, and predictable. This predictability reduced uncertainty while limiting variation. Daily schedules became reliable. Expectations were clear. Surprises were rare. Evenings ended quietly. Streets emptied on time. Lights dimmed. Sleep arrived through routine rather than reflection. Morning resumed familiar patterns. Work began. Notices were read. Tasks were completed. Public discourse remained restrained. Language emphasized duty and order. Tone remained calm. Over time, the system reinforced itself. Procedures generated more procedures. Compliance supported continuity. Ordinary citizens experienced control not as interruption, but as framework. Life continued within defined boundaries. There were no clear moments that marked the shift. Instead, control expanded through accumulation, one regulation after another. The environment encouraged adjustment rather than resistance. Routine softened impact. By the time changes were fully established, they felt familiar. Life had adapted quietly. History later described this period in broader terms. Experienced at the time, it felt like daily life continuing under new rules that resembled old ones. The state's presence was constant but understated. It organized time, movement, and expectation. Days passed without dramatic events. Weeks blended together. Months followed predictable patterns. Life under increasing control was defined by schedules, regulations, and routine compliance rather than sudden transformation. It was lived not as a series of decisions, but as continuation, each day following the last, guided by structure and repetition. And so ordinary life proceeded.
The Second World War as a long, exhausting continuum. When the Second World War unfolded across Europe and beyond, it did not present itself to most people as a single, continuous surge of action. Instead, it arrived as a prolonged condition, extending day after day with few clear boundaries. Time did not move quickly. It accumulated. Weeks passed through schedules, paperwork, and repeated routines that shaped the experience more than decisive moments. Planning occupied much of the war's duration. Meetings were held regularly, often in the same rooms, at the same tables, with the same participants. Maps were unfolded, smoothed and marked. Lines were drawn and redrawn. Symbols were added, removed, and replaced. These actions consumed hours without producing immediate change. Documents circulated steadily. Reports were written, reviewed, summarized, and filed. Figures were checked and rechecked. Language remained formal and cautious. Conclusions were tentative. Decisions were postponed when possible and revised when necessary. The process emphasized continuity rather than urgency. Travel between offices and headquarters followed established routes. Trains departed on schedules that were adjusted but predictable. Vehicles moved along familiar roads. Movement suggested activity, yet often resulted only in further discussion. Arrival led to waiting, and waiting led back to planning. The war's daily rhythm was administrative. Orders were issued, clarified, and amended. Messages were sent and received. Timelines were adjusted incrementally. Each day brought similar tasks that differed only in detail. Progress was measured in coordination rather than outcomes. Maps played a central role. They covered tables and walls, their surfaces layered with markings that represented positions, routes, and objectives. Participants studied them quietly, tracing paths with fingers or pencils. Changes were noted carefully. These visual aids absorbed attention while time passed. Logistics required constant management. Supplies were counted, stored, transported, and redistributed. Inventories were maintained meticulously. Shortages were anticipated and mitigated through substitution. These processes unfolded slowly, demanding patience and repetition. Meetings followed predictable formats. Agendas were reviewed. Updates were delivered. Questions were raised and deferred. Notes were taken. Sessions ended without resolution and were scheduled to resume. The repetition created familiarity that reduced tension, but also slowed momentum. Communication networks functioned continuously. Messages moved through channels that emphasized accuracy over speed. Delays were common and accepted. Clarification required additional correspondence. The flow of information remained steady, not swift. For those involved in planning, days were long but uniform. Morning began with briefings. Afternoons were filled with analysis. Evenings extended into review. Fatigue accumulated gradually, dulling emotional response. Urgency gave way to endurance. Beyond planning centers, the war continued through logistics and maintenance. Transportation routes operated persistently. Goods moved in steady streams. Schedules were revised repeatedly to accommodate changing conditions. Each adjustment required further coordination. Training and preparation followed routine cycles. Instructions were repeated. Procedures were practiced. Evaluation emphasized consistency. Innovation was limited by the need for standardization. Repetition became the primary method of reliability. Weather influenced operations quietly. Rain slowed movement. Cold affected schedules. Heat reduced efficiency. These conditions were noted in reports and incorporated into planning without commentary. The environment became another variable to manage. Time passed unevenly. Individual days felt long, yet months advanced quickly when viewed in retrospect. Calendars were consulted frequently, but they offered little comfort. The war extended beyond initial expectations, settling into a prolonged state. Behind the scenes, administrative work expanded. Additional staff processed paperwork. Offices reorganized. Filing systems grew more complex. The accumulation of records reflected the war's duration more clearly than any single event. The language used in communication remained restrained. Reports avoided emotional tone. Descriptions were technical. Outcomes were presented cautiously. This style reinforced distance and reduced immediacy. Public announcements reflected similar restraint. Statements emphasized continuity and effort rather than conclusion. Timelines were unspecified. Audiences absorbed information and returned to routine. Transportation hubs operated continuously. Trains arrived and departed. Cargo was loaded and unloaded. Personnel rotated. Activity suggested momentum, though destinations often led back to familiar tasks. Decision-making required consultation. Committees formed and dissolved. Recommendations circulated. Approval processes extended timelines. Action followed procedure rather than impulse. As the conflict continued, expectations adjusted. Initial assumptions about duration were revised repeatedly. Planning shifted from short-term objectives to long-term management. The war became something to administer rather than conclude quickly. Meetings grew longer. Participants relied on prepared materials. Discussion focused on logistics and coordination. Strategic considerations were framed by constraints rather than opportunity. Fatigue influenced tone. Conversation slowed. Pauses lengthened. Decisions required more time. The cumulative effect of years of routine reduced urgency without reducing obligation. Maps continued to change incrementally. Small adjustments replaced sweeping revisions. Each change required explanation, documentation, and redistribution of materials. The process consumed time without signaling finality. Supply chains required constant attention. Disruptions were addressed methodically. Alternatives were identified. Efficiency improved gradually through repetition rather than innovation. The passage of seasons provided subtle markers. Winter slowed activity. Spring resumed it. Summer extended workdays. Autumn returned familiar constraints. These cycles repeated, framing the war's duration. Records grew thicker. Archives expanded. Documentation preserved process rather than experience. The administrative memory of the war deepened steadily. Communication between different levels followed protocol. Messages moved upward and downward through established channels. Clarification took time. Consensus emerged slowly. Planning documents projected timelines that extended further into the future. These revisions required further planning. For many participants, the war became an environment rather than an event. It shaped daily schedules, determined tasks, and defined priorities without providing resolution. Even moments of change were absorbed into routine. Adjustments were implemented through new procedures. Familiarity returned quickly. As the conflict progressed, weariness became pervasive. It did not express itself dramatically. It settled quietly, influencing pace and tone. Endurance replaced anticipation. Long meetings continued. Maps remained central. Logistics dominated discussion.
The same processes repeated with minor variation. Time passed steadily. Announcements of progress arrived occasionally, framed carefully. They were noted, discussed briefly, and integrated into ongoing plans. The war's scale required coordination across vast distances. Communication bridged gaps slowly. Consistency was prioritized over speed. Administrative oversight expanded further. Compliance ensured continuity. Oversight generated additional paperwork. As years passed, the beginning of the war felt distant. The end remained undefined. The present consisted of routine management. When significant changes occurred, they were processed administratively. Reports were updated, procedures adjusted, work continued. The conflict's prolonged nature altered perception. The extraordinary became ordinary. The ongoing replaced the urgent. Eventually, signs of conclusion appeared through shifts in planning language and scheduling. These shifts were subtle and cautious. Preparation replaced speculation.
As the final years of conflict concluded, Germany entered a period unlike any it had experienced in decades. The collapse of the regime was neither sudden nor spectacular for most ordinary people. Instead, it arrived gradually, through absence, adjustment, and the slow disappearance of previous routines. Streets, buildings, and workplaces remained physically present, but the patterns of life that had defined decades began to dissolve quietly. Daily routines continued, though their meaning shifted. Mornings followed the same sequence: alarm clocks, breakfasts, and departures for work or errands. Yet the signals that had once guided behavior, official orders, schedules, and public announcements, were less consistent. Citizens noticed the change gradually, day by day, without a single clear moment that marked the transition. Offices that had once been central to administration began to operate differently. Some functions ceased entirely. Clerks arrived at desks to find forms unnecessary, files untouched, or offices closed. Work that had previously required attention and precision became redundant. Employees adapted slowly, occupying time with tasks that felt familiar but lacked purpose. Public spaces retained their structure but not their rhythm. Streetlights still illuminated intersections. Buses ran on recognizable routes. Shops opened and closed at ordinary hours. These markers of daily life persisted even as the systems that had regulated them faded. Continuity became a bridge between what had been and what was emerging. People moved through the city as before, following familiar paths. Footsteps echoed in hallways and on sidewalks, but the sound was quieter. Traffic was lighter. Activity retained form, but lost the sense of expectation that had accompanied it for years. The environment felt more neutral than tense, more calm than dynamic. Paperwork, once endless and obligatory, dwindled steadily. Forms remained on desks, yet fewer people required them. Letters and memos circulated more slowly. Administrative memory receded, leaving a sense of emptiness where structure had been constant. Adaptation to this void required patience, as old habits lingered even when unnecessary. Economic life proceeded unevenly. Shops offered goods, though selection varied. Customers entered, examined shelves, and purchased modestly. Transactions followed familiar routines. Prices stabilized over time, yet the uncertainty that had defined previous years lingered faintly. People learned to navigate both continuity and change simultaneously. Workplaces resumed basic operations cautiously. Factories opened machines with measured care. Employees fulfilled routine tasks without pressure. Supervisors monitored production lightly, emphasizing consistency over expansion. Days passed with repetition, marking time rather than achieving particular milestones. Transportation systems continued to operate. Trains arrived and departed on familiar schedules. Bus routes traversed city streets. Infrastructure endured, even as demand shifted. Schedules were maintained, offering predictability to those who relied upon it. Public announcements became infrequent. Notices appeared on walls and in papers without urgency or expectation. Citizens read, noted, and returned to daily tasks. The weight of authority that had once been present diminished gradually. Silence expanded into these spaces as clarity replaced command. Schools reopened and continued functioning. Lessons were conducted. Teachers followed established curricula. Children attended regularly. Instruction emphasized routine over innovation. Education provided structure for daily life, even as the surrounding environment remained unsettled. Neighborhoods experienced a subtle calm. Residents walked familiar routes. Conversations focused on immediate concerns, food, work, and domestic matters. Social engagement was quiet. The intensity of prior decades had dissipated. Interaction became functional, unhurried, and deliberate. Evening routines persisted. Lights were turned on at predictable times. Families gathered for meals. Children completed homework. Windows framed familiar streets in a gradually darkening light. Activities ended without ceremony. Sleep arrived, undisturbed by urgency, marking another ordinary passage of time. Weather continued its steady influence. Rain softened pavements. Snow blanketed streets. Sunlight warmed public squares. These natural cycles continued unchanged, providing continuity amid human uncertainty. Observation of weather offered simple reference points in the absence of structured schedules. Transportation of goods and resources occurred with a measured pace. Deliveries arrived predictably, though demand was lighter than before. Storage areas were maintained with care. Logistics focused on sustenance rather than expansion. Patterns resembled the routines of previous years, but carried less weight. Cultural and religious life adjusted quietly. Churches held services at familiar times. Attendance was modest. Music, theater, and exhibitions resumed with continuity in timing and content. These gatherings reinforced daily rhythm without creating urgency or excitement. Government presence diminished slowly. Offices were fewer. Officials were fewer still. Public oversight decreased slowly. Systems that had demanded constant attention now operated sporadically. Compliance continued through habit more than obligation. Letters and correspondence reflected this quiet. Communication persisted, but with reduced frequency. News traveled methodically. Discussion remained calm. Daily life absorbed information slowly, allowing adaptation without disruption. Memory of the regime's intensity persisted, but in diminished form. Individuals recalled routines and schedules, yet the urgency and discipline that had previously governed behavior were absent. Reflection was quiet. Emotion was subtle, often unnoticed in passing. Economic recovery followed cautiously. Markets stabilized over time. Production resumed gradually. Consumers adjusted to available goods. Transactions reflected normalcy, but memory of scarcity shaped behavior gently. Habits formed during previous years remained influential, guiding decisions without conscious reflection. Neighborhoods observed patterns of renewal. Streets were maintained. Lighting was repaired. Public infrastructure continued to function. Small improvements suggested stability, yet change remained deliberate rather than rapid. Incremental adjustment defined everyday life. Public spaces offered consistency. Parks remained open. Benches and walkways were maintained. Trees and gardens persisted as familiar features. Observation and presence became forms of quiet engagement with the surrounding environment. Transportation hubs operated steadily. Passengers moved along predictable routes, trains and buses maintained timetables, facilities were kept orderly, motion persisted as a signal of life rather than urgency. Daily schedules provided continuity. Morning led to afternoon, afternoon to evening. Meals were prepared, consumed, and cleaned up. Sleep followed predictable patterns. Life retained structure without imposition. Social gatherings occurred sparingly and quietly. Families visited one another. Conversations focused on routine concerns. Community activities were modest. Engagement emphasized presence over expression. Interaction became functional rather than performative. Administrative structures functioned in reduced capacity. Offices remained, but output was limited. Procedures were simplified. Compliance continued through familiarity. Habit replaced formal expectation. Education reinforced routine. Students attended classes, teachers guided schedules, curricula maintained continuity. Learning occurred within familiar patterns. Children grew accustomed to structure and repetition. Economic transactions continued steadily. Currency stabilized, prices remained predictable. Shoppers and merchants navigated routine exchanges with minimal adjustment. Continuity reinforced a sense of normalcy. Travel for personal purposes proceeded calmly. Individuals navigated familiar routes. Delays were minor and accepted without tension. Transportation offered both mobility and temporal structure. Cultural engagement persisted. Attendance at events remained moderate. Activities followed established calendars. Participation emphasized routine. Enthusiasm was quiet. Observation replaced expectation. Time itself acquired a measured pace. Weeks followed predictably. Months passed steadily. Seasonal cycles offered reference points. Change occurred incrementally. Individual